Real talk is talk real cheap, and the rest is just squawk. Cheep cheep. Two friends talking about everything, they trying to understand. Your friends with all these light bulbs be popping in our minds. Need to share our ideas with one another. Time to cheep cheep cheep. Our friends fully tripping cause we all hella booked up in these lives. But Saturday's the night when we get to riff and laugh, cause that's alright. Talk is cheap. Real talk is so cheap. It's so motherfucking cheap. Cheap. Can't be any cheaper, less it costs us something cheap. Because cheep is what it's gotta be. Cheep. Seriously, other than some time, cause that's all we're willing to spare. Cheep, cause that is all we got to share. We got to take it to board these planes of reality. They know they just missed their train to Trend Central. Hey, all aboard, it's a Saturday night train. Cheep, and real talk is cheaper than ever. Real talk is cheap, the real talk is cheap. Real talk is cheap, the real talk is cheap. Real talk is cheap, real talk is cheap. Real cheap talk, it's real talk, it's so cheap. It's so fucking cheap. Woo, real cheap. Woo, so cheap. Talk is cheap, the real talk is cheap. Real talk is cheap, the real talk is cheap. Real cheap talk, it's real talk, it's so cheap. It's so fucking cheap. Whoa, real cheap. Woo, so cheap.